I never thought I'd be the kind of man who kept a secret like this. But here I am, telling it anyway, not to justify it, not to beg forgiveness, just to admit it out loud. The truth didn't happen all at once. It came softly, like illness slow. Persistent, invisible at first. Adrian and I had been together for nearly 7 years. We lived in a quiet apartment with graying walls, the kind that absorbed silence too easily. He worked in corporate law, came home late, and made dinner 3 nights a week. I was a high school music teacher, sensitive, routine-bound, a lover of jasmine tea and worn paperbacks. We didn't argue. We just stopped laughing somewhere along the way. I got sick the week he flew to Atlanta for a conference. Nothing dramatic. Just a creeping ache in my joints, a dull fever, a chest that felt tight when I breathed deep. Adrian noticed before he left. He kissed my cheek, told me to rest, and reminded me not to forget the humidifier. His suitcase wheels clacked out the door, and I remember thinking the apartment felt too large with just me in it. By Wednesday, the ache hadn't left. I hadn't eaten much, and every movement felt like trudging through syrup. My friend Marla, always loud and alarmed, insisted I call her personal doctor, someone who made house visits. He's kind, she said, more human than most. I agreed, mostly to silence her. The idea of a stranger in my space made me anxious, but I was too tired to resist. The knock came promptly at 4. I opened the door in sweats and a worn hoodie, unshaven and unsure. Standing there was a man who did not look like any doctor I'd imagined. Elias? He asked, voice calm, deep. I'm Dr. Malik. He was tall, with warm bronze skin and sharp, thoughtful eyes. Not intimidating, not overly polished, just present. Fully present, in a way I hadn't seen in months. I stepped aside and let him in, embarrassed by the mess I hadn't cleaned. He didn't judge. Just walked in with his black bag, took my temperature, checked my throat, asked about symptoms. Efficient, but never cold. You've got mild bronchitis, he said, packing his things. Rest, hydrate, and I'll leave you something mild to help sleep. He paused, eyes lingering. A second longer than necessary. You live alone? I hesitated. No, my partner's away. Conference? He nodded slowly, like that explained something. Then, instead of leaving, he looked toward the kettle on the counter. Is that jasmine? I blinked. Yeah, I was just going to make a cup. Would you mind? He asked. I've been running since morning. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe because he asked gently. Maybe because I hadn't spoken to anyone all day. Or maybe because the house didn't feel so heavy with someone else in it. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, 2 mismatched mugs between us. The steam curled like smoke between silences. He asked about my teaching. I told him about my students, how one of them played Chopin by ear but refused to perform. He listened, not the way people wait their turn to talk, but truly listened. Somewhere between tea and his second glance at the window, I realized how long it had been since anyone looked at me like I mattered. Like I wasn't just part of the furniture in someone else's life. I watched his hand wrap around the mug, his fingers slender, his thumb gently tapping the rim. He stood to leave. I walked him to the door. He turned, said, You'll be okay. But don't be alone too long. It makes the fever linger. I nodded, unsure what he meant. As he left, his fingers brushed mine as I handed him his coat. The contact was accidental. Maybe. But the heat it left behind stayed longer than it should have. I stood at the doorway after he'd gone, staring at the empty hallway, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. That night, as the city hummed beneath the windows, and the fever faded in my chest, I realized the ache I'd felt wasn't just sickness. It was something older, lonelier. Something deeper. And Dr. Malik had seen it without me saying a word. I never planned to let anyone into that part of my life. Not emotionally, and certainly not like this. But sometimes betrayal doesn't storm and it seeps through the cracks. We ignored. Adrian and I had built something that resembled stability. 7 years together, and our routines had solidified into silent agreements. He handled the finances, I managed the home. We loved each other, at least in the way people do when they've forgotten how to be new. Somewhere between Netflix queues and shared grocery lists, intimacy had turned to inertia. Asterisk when I came down with the flu feverish. Aching and drained, it wasn't dramatic, just inconvenient. Adrian was flying out the next morning for a 4-day tech conference in Boston. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly and muttered, "Rest up, babe. I left soup in the fridge." Then the door clicked shut behind him, and I was alone in our apartment, shivering under 2 blankets that didn't help. Asterisk by the second day, the ache had become more than physical. My body throbbed in places I didn't know could ache. But worse was the heaviness, like my loneliness had weight. A shape pressing into my chest. Asterisk it was Marissa, a colleague from school, who texted me about a doctor she knew. "He does house. Calls, old school, discreet. Kind," she wrote. I hesitated. The idea of a stranger entering my space while I looked like a soggy tissue made me cringe. But the chills were getting worse, and the last thing I wanted was an awaiting room. I texted the number she gave. Asterisk the knock came just past 4 in the afternoon. I opened the door and found myself face to face with a man who didn't look like any doctor I'd seen before. Dr. Khalid Malik, mid-30s, olive skin, trimmed beard, a quiet confidence in the way he carried his black leather bag he wore. No white coat, just a navy sweater and dark slacks. Asterisk, "You must be Elias," he said. His voice was calm, with the kind of warmth that made you feel safe instantly. Asterisk, I nodded, stepped aside, and tried not to look as pathetic as I felt. Asterisk, Dr. Malik entered without fanfare. He was efficient, gentle, checked my vitals, listened to my lungs, asked me about my symptoms without the detached tone most doctors use. Asterisk, "You've got the early stages of bronchitis," he said, scribbling something into a small notebook. "Rest, fluids? I'll prescribe a mild antibiotic and a stronger fever reducer." Asterisk, he looked around briefly. "Anyone home with you?" Asterisk, "My partner's out of town," I said. The words felt heavier than I intended. Asterisk, he nodded. "Try not to be alone too long. Illness doesn't like isolation." Asterisk, it was a strange thing to say. I looked at him, trying to gauge if he meant something more. But his expression remained neutral. Asterisk, he closed his bag, stood, and made his way toward the door. I followed, grateful and slightly embarrassed. Asterisk, just before stepping out, he paused. "Do you drink tea?" Asterisk, I blinked. "Jasmine, mostly." Asterisk, a faint smile touched his lips. "Good choice." Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and left. The door clicked softly behind him. I stood there, hand on the knob, uncertain why my pulse had quickened. It wasn't what he said. It wasn't even what he did. It was something quieter, a recognition, perhaps, of being seen without having to explain. Asterisk later that night, I poured myself a cup of jasmine tea and sat by the window, watching the amber city lights flicker across the rain-slicked streets. I told myself it was nothing. Just a kind doctor, a routine visit, a professional exchange. Asterisk, but when I lay down, I felt the ghost of his gaze in the room with me. And somehow, it warmed places I hadn't felt in years. I closed my eyes, willing myself to forget, but my body remembered. Asterisk. Adrian returned on a Thursday afternoon, suitcase in hand, shoulders sagging from jet lag. He kissed my cheek like nothing had changed, like I was still the same man he'd left shivering under a blanket. I tried to mirror the gesture, tried to make it feel real, but something inside me had shifted. Not entirely broken, not yet, just altered. Asterisk, "I brought that ginger tea you like," he said, unloading his bag onto the kitchen counter. "The one from that boutique place you always forget the name of?" Asterisk, I smiled, nodded, grateful for the thoughtfulness, but also unnerved. The timing made it worse. If he had been cold, indifferent, or forgetful, maybe I could have justified what I did. But Adrian was kind, just distant. And that was always the harder betrayal to mourn, the one born not from cruelty, but from disconnection. Asterisk, we ate dinner in the soft hum of our overhead lights. He told me about the conference, the keynote speaker who choked on his words, the marketing guy who drank too much at the gala. I laughed in the right places, asked the right questions. I played my part. So, well, I almost believed it, but I couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Malik's touch. His hands steady yet searching. His voice, the low timbre that cut through the static of my loneliness. It wasn't just what we did. It was what it awakened. I didn't tell Adrian. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I didn't know how to translate the ache I carried into language he'd understand. He'd see it as a breach, and maybe it was. But to me, it felt like something closer to a mirror. A revelation of the emptiness I had long mistaken for contentment. That night, as he brushed his teeth beside me, I watched him in the mirror. He stood half-turned, humming softly, oblivious. I studied the lines of his face, the small patch of stubble he'd missed on his jaw. I remembered how those details used to feel sacred little things I memorized when love was new. Now. They felt like bookmarks in a novel I no longer reread. I went to bed early. Adrian joined later, slipping in quietly, his arm resting loosely across my waist. I stared at the ceiling, counting each breath, each beat of guilt that drummed behind my ribs. His touch didn't feel invasive, it felt borrowed, as if he were reaching for a version of me that had quietly left the room. In the morning, I found the tea he'd bought sitting on the counter. A note in his handwriting read, "Boil it for 3 minutes, like you always do. Thought of you." I held it in my hands longer than I should have, as if waiting for the words to accuse me. Instead. They did something worse. They reminded me that Adrian still cared, just in the way he always had, consistently, distantly, politely, and maybe that was the real tragedy. Not the kiss with Dr. Malik, not the betrayal, but the quiet realization that what I once called love had become more about memory than presence. I didn't contact Dr. Malik again. I wanted to. Every night I hovered over his number, thumb trembling, wondering if he was thinking about me too. But I knew whatever existed between us wasn't built to last. It had come in a moment of weakness and clarity, two forces rarely meant to stay. Instead, I began writing something I never intended to send. A letter, a confession, addressed to no one and everyone. You made me feel like I wasn't fading, like I hadn't already disappeared. I folded the paper, tucked it into a drawer beneath my sweaters. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud to leave a mark. As days passed, I returned to my routines. Adrian and I made plans again, dinner with friends. A weekend trip we'd been postponing. On the surface, everything looked the same, but I had changed, and some changes don't shout, they whisper, quietly altering the way you see the world and the people in it.